Many people worry, for example, that the proliferation of deepfakes and other forms of artificial content have a bad impact on the quality of our democracies. Artificial intelligence is a very blurry and in some ways misleading concept because it's a sort of like umbrella term for very diverse digital technologies. So it's not necessarily a thing, but more like a box that comprises things from facial recognition systems to something like ChatGPT, but maybe also a system that you can use to power a robot in a factory or something like that. In that sense, the label sometimes suggests a coherence to AI as a set of technologies that actually isn't there. For roughly 6 years now, the European Union has tried to develop a legal framework around AI in order to make sure that as these technologies develop, European societies can reap the benefits, while at the same time making sure that the risks that come from these technologies don't get out of hand. And in this year, in 2024, the European Parliament and the European Council have finally adopted a legal framework, so an AI Act, a law about artificial intelligence in Europe. The situation is that while the Europeans have a relatively well-developed legal framework for AI, in other respects, they're clearly lagging behind the United States and also China. So as technology leaders, it is the US and the Chinese companies that clearly lead the pack. And many of our digital technologies here in Europe are in fact supplied by American companies. So we try to figure out what is a smart way of adjusting European policy about digital technologies and about AI in particular in order to deal with this dependence on the rest of the world. A sentiment that you find very strongly in Brussels is the fear of missing out on the next wave of digital technologies. Over the past few years, we see what feels like a contradictory pattern. On the one hand, if you look at economic statistics, the United States in particular clearly powers ahead, say during the past 10, 15 years, whereas economic growth in Europe has been relatively flat or stagnant. Many people who look at this development with a set of, say, economists' glasses, looking at these kind of numbers, conclude that there is something wrong right now in Europe, namely that we need more economic vigor, that we need more of an entrepreneurial spirit, that we need more economic growth. And they then immediately point to the thriving tech sector in the United States, Silicon Valley, if you will, and the absence of a European version of a Silicon Valley. So there's this idea, we in Europe too, if we want the same kind of economic growth rates that the United States enjoys, we too need some kind of European Silicon Valley. So the dynamic right now is one where the United States is held up as a shining example, and the Europe is basically considered the sick continent in that respect. What's complicated there, and where I feel that this imagery is a little bit off the mark, is that in many other ways you would get the impression that the United States actually isn't doing so well. That would concern, for example, the enormous inequality that we see in the United States, that would concern many indicators of well-being of many American citizens. So there seems to be a divergence between something that looks like economic superachievement, but on many societal indicators actually something that doesn't go so well. My impression is that for many people in Brussels, the election success of Donald Trump came as quite a surprise. And I think many have been taken aback by the speed with which the atmosphere in transatlantic relations and also in Washington itself has changed since then. Somebody like Elon Musk, who had already emerged as a close ally of Donald Trump in the run-up to the election, has since then continued to take a very prominent role. And in general, you already see a dynamic where many of the large tech companies in the United States, and so I'm thinking of companies not only Elon Musk's X, for example, but also Meta, which owns Instagram and WhatsApp and Facebook, for example, Microsoft, Google, and so on and so forth, where they really, you could say, suck up to Donald Trump quite a bit because they're potentially afraid that he might severely push back against them. So what you see is that there is basically sort of like a rallying effect of large American companies who are sort of afraid of Donald Trump and what he might be able to do to them around this new administration that's forming. And that's clearly leading in a different direction than where Europe thought it would be going with digital technology. So there is a rift in vision of what kind of digitization, what kind of digital companies we'll have in the world. And the question whether we'll still have sort of like an integrated space digital space between the United States and Europe, where you have similar kinds of apps, similar kinds of social media platforms, similar kinds of rules, that seems very much in doubt. The situation in which we are now, in which almost all of our key digital technologies are supplied from outside of Europe, makes us very vulnerable. For a relatively long time, that didn't feel like a big problem, because, say, we felt that we had very friendly relationships with the United States government, say many of our small electronic devices, iPhones, this sort of stuff coming from China wasn't really a problem. If, however, we see that there's growing tension, geopolitical tension between countries, and that there are clear differences in vision between, say, a Trump government in the United States, what we want here in Europe, and the Chinese government elsewhere, then I think it does become more important that we say, well, we are also, in terms of where the software comes from, where the computers come from, where the microchips come from, actually in charge and in control of our own digital environment, so that we can't just be arm twisted into following somebody else because we completely depend on them.